Hello, I'm Mary Beth Farrell, and this is a recording of my presentation for the Module 6 assignment. Module 6 focused on the questions that must be answered during the planning of a research project. If you thought that there isn't very much work done before the experiment starts and that most of the work occurs during the data collection phase, you'd be wrong. During the presentation, I will be discussing the steps in preparing to conduct a research study. I'll provide an overview of the IRB process, and I'll describe the processes for selecting the sample size, test instruments, and methods. So let's get started. I'm going to begin by discussing the 12 steps that must be completed before any data is ever collected. The first step is finding a topic. Ideas for topics can come from efforts in everyday life to solve problems. For instance, you might want to develop an experiment to find the best method for making hard-boiled eggs so the shell comes off easily. My husband and I have been trying to figure this out for years. Research ideas can result from practical issues such as how to end the opioid crisis. Research can build on the work of previous investigators. One of the ways to generalize quantitative research is through replication of a study with diverse subjects at different times and diverse situations. Finally, research ideas can come from theoretical predictions about how or why the world works that turns into hypotheses. The next step is to narrow down the scope of your project. Your project is going to need to be manageable with control of extraneous variables. Therefore, the scope cannot be too broad. For instance, if I go back to the best method of cooking a hard-boiled egg, when I Google the topic, 591,000 hits come up. Therefore, to narrow down the scope and be more specific, I could focus on methods for peeling easy. The third step is to review the literature. The purpose is to become familiar with the topic and gain an understanding of what is currently known about the subject. The literature search can provide information on the amount of previous research done on the topic. It can help you to identify methods and instruments needed to test your hypothesis. Finally, the literature research provides valuable information that you will use later in putting the results of your study into the context of previous studies. The fourth step is probably the most important, and that is to define the research problem. The goal is to ensure the investigator understands the problem to be solved and understands the inclusion and exclusion criteria. The research problem should be in the form of a question that inquires whether there is a relationship between two or more variables. In our example, my husband and I could question whether putting the hard-boiled egg into ice water affects the ease of peeling off the shell. With the research question defined, hypotheses can be formulated. A hypothesis is a prediction of how the results of an investigation will turn out. First, a null hypothesis is tested. The null hypothesis predicts that there is no relationship between the independent and dependent variables. Using my egg experiment, the null hypothesis would be that there is no relationship between putting the egg in ice water after boiling and ease in which the shell comes off. My husband thinks that there is a relationship, but I think the null hypothesis is correct. The research hypothesis or alternative hypothesis is that the shorter amount of time between boiling the egg and putting the egg into ice water, the more easily the shell comes off. The fifth step is to define the population or the full set of elements from which you will be sampling. In our egg experiment, we could focus on organic eggs. Of course, we would carefully need to operationalize the nature of being organic. The sixth step is to determine the research design or strategy that will be used to answer the research question and test the hypothesis. Our goal is to pick the strongest research design that is doable, practical, and ethical. I'm not going to cover research designs in this presentation. As I just mentioned, the proposed project must be feasible. Important factors to consider include time, availability of subjects, expenses, investigator knowledge and skills, and potential ethical issues. The eighth step is to create the project plan. This involves determining the timeline or project milestones, figuring out which individuals will be required, and defining who will do what, where, and how the data will be collected. The ninth step of writing the research proposal is also critically important, as the research proposal will be used to decide funding and IRB approval. Writing the proposal means making decisions on the sampling method, the level of power and sample size, participant recruitment, methods of assigning participants to groups, which measurement instruments will be used, how the data will be analyzed, the step-by-step procedure that will be followed, and any debriefing that will need to be done. The 10th step is obtaining institutional review board approval for the project, and I'll be talking more about that in a moment. The 11th step is obtaining informed consent. The final step is to conduct a pilot study to test the soundness of your research experiment and to identify and correct any problems that could ruin your experiment or bias your results. Once all of these preliminary steps are accomplished, you're finally ready to conduct the experiment and begin collecting data. Now I'll move on and discuss the process for obtaining IRB approval of the research study. There are 4 basic ethical principles: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-malfeasance. Autonomy means that research subjects have the right to make fully informed decisions regarding participation in research, and that decisions are free from coercion. The idea of justice is that both the benefits and burdens should be shared equally across society. Beneficence demands that procedures only be performed that will benefit the patient, and non-malfeasance means that procedures should be free from unnecessary harm. To protect the rights I just discussed, along with the right to privacy, investigators must seek approval of the study from an institutional review board, or an IRB. IRB approval is required before the start of any research project involving human subjects. Research is defined as a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute generalizable knowledge. Following the review, the IRB may approve, disapprove, or request modifications to a research protocol. The decision is made based on the level of risk to the subjects weighed against the anticipated benefits to the individual or society as a whole. There are 3 levels of review that an IRB uses to evaluate research proposals: exempt, expedited, and full board review. A protocol may be exempt from IRB review if it meets one of the federally designated exemption categories, such as research related to educational processes, or research using existing data documents and records if the information is publicly available or anonymized. A protocol may be expedited when it involves minimally invasive procedures such as blood samples drawn by fingerstick or venipuncture, collection of samples by non-invasive means such as hair samples and nail clippings, data from non-invasive diagnostic tests such as an EKG or ultrasound, collection of information from data previously collected for non-research purposes, collection of data from voice or video recordings, and research on behaviors or surveys and interviews. Any research that does not meet one of the 2 previous categories I just mentioned must go through full board review. I've obtained IRB approval for several studies, and it's very comprehensive. There are several steps in preparing for an IRB submission. First, determine who will be the primary investigator for the study. Next, form the team and ensure that all the team members have completed an ethics training course. Next, determine the research sites and obtain any necessary data use agreements, HIPAA documentation, or other paperwork. The 4th step is to decide if your study meets exempt or expedited review. Then you have to complete a plethora of forms. After completing the IRB application forms, you need to create the actual consent forms that will be used. The 7th step is to document the recruitment methods and incentives. You need to have the actual advertisements or communications that you will use to recruit participants. Next, you need to document the testing instruments that will be used during the study and their respective potential for harm. As I mentioned earlier, you must complete a research proposal that includes things like the purpose of the study population, the anticipated risks and benefits, the research procedure, the informed consent procedure, and the procedure for maintaining confidentiality. And finally, you need to complete any other forms that might be necessary, such as forms for permission to access records, radiation and biohazard declarations, and Food or Drug Administration documentation. Once you've completed all of this and submitted your IRB application, you sit back with your fingers crossed, waiting for the decision. Now I'll move on and describe how to choose the sample size, research instruments, and methods for a research study. Determining the sample size is tricky business. The goal is to have enough subjects to be able to measure an effect, but no more subjects than is necessary. More subjects means greater cost. The decision is contingent upon the study design, including the number of groups, the amount of variability in the data, and the method of statistical analysis that will be used. The more subjects in an investigation, the greater the statistical power. Power is defined as the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis. What the heck does that mean? Well, remember that the null hypothesis is the prediction that there is no relationship between the dependent and independent variable. So if you appropriately reject the null hypothesis, that means you are declaring there is a relationship between, or that there was a significant effect on the dependent variable by the independent variable. By convention, we assume that 80% of the time we would like to reject the null hypothesis appropriately. The power of statistical analysis is dependent upon the alpha level, the number of subjects, and the effect size. Effect size is a measure of the difference between two groups. It can simply be thought of as small, medium, and large differences. The alpha level is the significance level. It is the likelihood of incorrectly rejecting the null hypothesis when it is really true. An alpha level of 0.05 is standard in most social and psychological research. An alpha level of 0.05 means that there is a 5% chance of incorrectly determining there is a difference when there isn't a difference. Numerous tables and calculators are available that can determine the number of subjects you need for your study based on your selected power and alpha level, along with the effect size. The only other things you need to factor into the calculation are the number of groups in the study and the statistical tests, such as a t-test or regression analysis, that will be used. Measurements generate the data collected during the research study. Measurement is very dependent on the tests or instruments chosen. It is important to select tools that are reliable, accurate, and if appropriate, have established norms. It is good practice to use an established instrument with documented validity as opposed to constructing a new instrument. There is a wide variety of measures that can be used in any investigation. For methods, I'm assuming that this is the procedures followed during the investigation. The method should describe in detail the exact steps or procedures to be performed. As I mentioned previously, the research plan and proposal define who will do what, where, when, and how. This includes what the participants will do or what will be done to them. It involves the order in which things will be done, the instructions for how the subjects will be handled, and the instructions that will be provided to the participants must be carefully documented. The methods further describe the exact data collection procedure. Finally, the method should include the rationale and process for debriefing subjects when appropriate. So in conclusion for this assignment, I've discussed the steps in preparing to conduct a research study. I provided an overview of the IRB process, and I've described the processes for selecting the sample size, test instruments, and methods. I'll close with a list of my references.